So now we're on Daf Nun Vav and Beis, and we're studying Rabbi Shimon Af Nishchat al Oso Mokom. Rabbi Shimon is even more makil. Not only does he allow you to create a balmum in, like Rabbi Meir says, in other parts of the body of the animal, and not only does he allow doing a mum in that part of the animal where it would become a balmum, like in the ears, which Rabbi Shimon prohibited. I'm sorry, which Chacham prohibited. Shelo yishchar al osomum. Now we have Rabbi Shimon who goes one step further, and he's makil even in a place where it's going to cause the animal to become a balmum. And Rabbi Yehuda Omer, afilu mes ein makiz lo dam. Rabbi Yehuda is the most machmir, and he says we don't do hakozas adam, even though it was a chazodam, even after the animal died. So again, all this is a four-way machlokes that has to do mostly, except of Reb Shimon, with the chashash and the gzeira d'Rabbanon that we shouldn't allow for situations where the Kohen might seem to be artificially creating a balmum. So again, even though the Chachamim hold that there's no prohibition against inflicting a blemish in the animal that's already blemished, the animal is suffering already from a severe life-threatening disease called blood congestion, so it's already a balas mum, and therefore it's exempt from the prohibition of blemishing a bechor, which we'll have a little bit later on today. But in any event, nevertheless, the Rabbanan permit puncturing the animal even in a place where a permanent blemish will be caused. But if the ailment can be cured by other means, then the animal is not a balas mum, and therefore you're not allowed to let blood from the animal. Okay, now we have Reb Shimon, and as we said, Reb Shimon says af nishchat al oso mum. In other words, on the one hand, Reb Shimon agrees with the Rabbanon that you can blemish a critically ill animal, but the Rabbanon were prohibiting the animal's slaughter. And comes along Reb Shimon, he says, let him slaughter it. And this is based on Reb Shimon's Shita in many, many places in Shas, especially in Maseches Shabbos, that a davar she'ein miskaven is mutter. And therefore, since he has no intention of making the animal into a balmum, therefore there's no problem. Okay. Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that davar she'ein miskaven is also. Okay, fine. So again, we have four different shitos recorded in this brisa about whether hakaza is forbidden in a case where the animal is already suffering from that congestion, as we call it. So again, even though mitzad the maisa that he's doing, I'm going according to those shitas of the Tanoim without review that are makil, that maisa itself could create a blemish. It might definitely create a blemish, but it doesn't matter because the animal's already blemished. So we don't look at the maisa, but rather at the result of the maisa. So the iser is to create an animal that's a balas mum, but if the animal is already a balas mum, then there's no iser. Might be darbanans, but not dorais. All four Tanoim that we had in the Brisa will agree that b'mechametz achar mechametz shehu chayav, meaning that even though we had many Tanoim in the previous Brisa about a bechor shechazo dam that hold that the whole iser is in the totzah, and therefore if the animal is already a balas mum, there's no iser in doing an action that would make it into a balas mum. Nevertheless, says Rabbi Yochanan, in a case of mechametz achar mechametz, where he processes the dough and makes it leaven, even though it's already leavened, And you would say that the Isser is only in the Totzah, and here you already have the Totzah. No, says Rabbi Yochanan, we have a special pasuk, Dechsiv lo taseh chametz lo te'afeh chametz. So now, even though the Torah already said lo te'aseh chametz, which would certainly include afia when you make it into chametz, nevertheless the Torah went out of its way to mention lo se'afeh chametz. And why is baking mentioned separately in its own pasuk? To tell you that even if the chefta is already afui, it's already baked, nevertheless you're not allowed to do the baking. So the mais afia is itself prohibited under this law. And where do we find something very similar? B'misares achar misares. That even though the animal has already been castrated, if you castrate it again, you're chayav, shu chayav. And again, we're going to need a pasuk for that. Why? Because you would say that sirus is not the maisa sirus, but rather totzas ha'maisa. This animal is already misuras. Because the pasuk says uma'uch v'kasus v'natuk v'karus, and when the Torah defines the various isurim involved in the prohibition of castrating an animal, there's something here that's totally unnecessary. And that is nasuk. Why? Nasuk means it's detached. The private genitals are detached. And imal akores hu chayav, al notek lo kolshken. Right? If he does an incision in the testicles, he's chayav. That's called kores, korus. Then how much more so he's chayav in nasuk? So why did the Torah have to tell me nasuk, where he detached that whole el lahavi nosek acha kores hu chayav? That in the case of nosek, you're going to be chayav even if there was already an incision, the animal was already castrated, the totzah has already been achieved, and now you're doing just a maisa sirus. No, you're chayav for a maisa sirus. So again, Rav Chiya bar Abba is telling you all these different cases where you're chayav for the maisa, even though the totzah is already a given, it's already a reality. Lo nechleko b'matil mum b'balas mum. Here we have machlok shin Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim specifically about adding a mum to an animal that's already a mum. Rabbi Meir savar, Rabbi Meir is going to be machmir because he holds kol mum lo yebo, meaning that there's an extra word kol here to be marbe, adding a mum when it already has a mum. Rabbanan Savri, no, tamim yeh l'rotzon. The pasuk that comes immediately before this pasuk of kol mum lo yebo says tamim yeh l'rotzon. It shall be unblemished l'rotzon, to find favor as a carbon lifnei Hashem. And that pasuk before the prohibition of kol mum lo yebo is telling me that forget about the word kol. You know, you wanted to use the word kol. Rabbi Meir wanted to use the word kol to tell you that if you add a blemish after a blemish, you're chayav for the second maisa of mum. And the Rabbanan say, no. The Torah says, tamim yeh l'ratzon. So therefore, it's only l'ratzon if it's tamim, if it's shlema, if it doesn't have a bal mum. Once it has a bal mum, it's excluded. Rabbi Meir Nami, what is Rabbi Meir going to do with Aksiv? Tamim yeh l'ratzon, hahu l'mu'ute bal mum me'ikara, if the animal is born with a mum. And in that case, the Torah is telling me that since the animal was never royal mizbech, was dochui me'ikara, right? Bal mum is dochui me'ikara. Therefore, to add a blemish is not prohibited. But in a case where the animal became a bal mum, it took sick and its blood coagulated, whatever it is, then the prohibition of making it into a bal mum still applies. Gemara doesn't like it. Bal mum me'ikara dikla bi'almahu. I don't get it. Even if the animal wasn't born with a deformity from birth, nevertheless, right now, the animal became a bal mum. the animal now has ochzodam. And if that be the case, dikla v'almahu, it's like a tree. And there's no isa to blemish a tree. Ella says the Gemara, Lima'ute psuli amakdoshim liachar pijonam. Now, when an animal gets a mum, you're allowed to be poda the animal. Normally, Kedushas HaGuf precludes any pigeon. But if the animal that has Kedushas HaGuf now becomes blemished and it's a balas mum, now you're allowed to do the pigeon. But wait a second. When you do the pigeon and you transfer the Kedusha from the animal over to the mos, what's the story with the animal? Is the animal still in a state of kajim? And the answer is, you're not allowed to shear the wool off the back of the sheep. You're not allowed to work the animal. In other words, there's still a shirayim, there's still something that bleibt, how do you say, that is left in the animal, even after you did pigeon, is therefore b'mumim nami litzar. I need a pasuk to tell me that you will not violate any iser by adding a mum to the animal, because even though it's also begiz of avoda, but nevertheless, kamash malan, the Torah is going to tell me that after the pigeon, you've stripped the animal of most of its status as kachim, although there's still some shirayim left over for gizva voda, and therefore there's no iser of going ahead and doing an action which would make it into a balmum. What are they going to do with the word kol mum? And they're going to allow you to add a blemish when there already is a blemish, that we need for a brisa. So what is the nature of this brisa? Kol mum lo yebo, ainli el shelo yehebo mum. Okay, you're not allowed to inflict directly, but what about groma? What about an indirect action which causes the animal to become a bal mum? Like you put something on the animal. So one example of groma would be if you hire somebody else to make it into a balas mum. Another example is you put something very heavy on the ear, because like we said before, that the ear is a limb which makes the animal into a balas mum. So you put something very heavy, and over the course of time, the weight of that thing that's tied down to the animal's ear, for example, dough or pressed figs, is kidei shiyovo akel vitlena. And now what's going to happen is the dog is very attracted by the smell of pressed figs or dough, and the animal is going to jump on the dog is going to jump on the ear of the animal, and it's going to make it into a balas mum. How do we know that that's prohibited? You're not doing the action of making it into a balas mum. You didn't puncture the ear with your yadayim. You're only setting up a grama. Talmud lomar, omar mum, v'omar kol mum. It could have said mum, and the Torah added kol mum, and the kol mum is coming to be marba, the iser, to expand the iser of putting a mum into an animal, even begroma. Rabbi Ami, Hayniach Siora Gabi Isa v'Holach v'Yoshev Lo v'Nischam Tzemei Leo Chayav Oleo Kimaisa Shabbos. Rabbi Ami comes with an analogy to Shabbos, and in a case where he puts Sior, right? Sior, we said, was that which speeds up the process of leavening. We call it today yeast. And he placed it on top of a dough, and he goes his own merry way. And in the meantime, the dough became chametz, which is a violation of the law of lo ta'afel chametz. And Rabbi Yami says, Chayet. How do I know this? Says Rabbi Yami, I know it from an equation, an analogy to Shabbos. In fact, the Gemara, Ma'aseh Shabbos ki hay gavna mi mechayev. Why do you assume the premise, Ravami, that in Shabbos, if you would just put something on something else and it would be groma, you're going to be chayav? How do you know you're going to be chayav? On the contrary, Omar Rabba Bar Chana, Omar Rabbi Yochanan, Iniach Basal Gabi Gecholim, Hipek Lo Chayav Lo Hipek Lo Chayav Potur. Grama causing something is an incomplete maisa. And the Gemara understood that Rabbi Ami's point was premised on the assumption that in Shabbos you'd be chai for an incomplete maisa. But now we're proving from the statement of Rabbi Yochanan that no, when you grill meat, you got to grill it on both sides. It's not enough that you place the meat on top of the fire, on top of the coals, and then you walk away, so that only the underside of the meat is grilled, but the top side of the meat is not perfectly grilled. Is lo hipach ba patur. Since he didn't turn it upside down to make sure that the fire would burn, what word do I want to use? Would not fry, what's it called? Would grill. Oh, we'll use the word grill in the meantime, right? Will grill the meat on both sides, you're not chayav. So how can Rav Ami say that there's an equation between, putting the yeast on the mincha and causing the chimutz to a case of, putting meat on coals on Shabbos? Putting meat on coals on Shabbos is not going to be machayev. It's not a malacha because lo hafachbo, he didn't turn it upside down. And here we'll complete. Omar Rava, my chayev nami deka Omar kemaiset tzli shel Shabbos. In what case did Rav Ami say that if you left dough of a mincha in such a place that it will become leavened, that you chayev? That's kemaiset tzli. Oh, that was the word I needed. Roasting. Sorry. Kemaiset tzli shel Shabbos. And what is maiset tzli shel Shabbos? You're only chayev for roasting on Shabbos when he rotates the meat, turns it to its other side, and it's thoroughly roasted. And so too, that's going to be in a parallel case, Rabbi Ami, in which he's chayev for the leavening of a mincha. Oh, only when he places the yeast on both sides of the dough. In other words, it's not enough that you put it on one side of the dough and it'll cause leavening on that side of the dough. That's an incomplete leavening. You're only b'chayev, says Rabbi Yami, if you turn the dough onto the other side and then put the yeast on the other side, so then it'll leaven on both sides, and that's equivalent to the case of grilling of tzli on Shabbos, where you're only chayev for putting the meat on the grill and then turning it over to the other side. So that leads us to Gufa, which in Yitz Hashem will pick up tomorrow, and I'll take this opportunity to wish you a great day and Shavua Tov. Thank you.